The phone rang sharply, breaking through the quiet hum of the morning. I didn't recognize the number, but I instinctively answered, my heart racing with some strange, unexplainable instinct. Mom? My son's voice was fragile, distant, and something in it made my chest tighten. Sweetie, what's wrong? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but my heart was already pounding. Something about his tone sent a wave of panic through me. Mom, they're not coming. He hesitated, the words shaky, as if unsure how to explain. I froze. What did he mean, they're not coming? He was supposed to have his surgery today. His first real procedure, and I had been preparing for weeks. He needed me there. Why wasn't anyone there? What do you mean, honey? Who's not coming? I asked, my voice trembling now. The grandparents. Grandma and Grandpa. They said they're too busy. They're taking Daisy to the spa, he said, his voice breaking as if the weight of that sentence alone was too much for him to bear. My stomach twisted. A spa day? They were supposed to be with him, holding his hand as he went under anesthesia, keeping him calm. But instead, they were prioritizing their dog over their grandson. I felt the protective rage flood my body, but I didn't let it show. Not yet. Okay, sweetheart, I said, my voice strained as I forced myself to remain calm. I'm coming. Stay with me, okay? Stay calm. I hung up and rushed to the front door, my hands trembling as I grabbed my keys, throwing them into my bag. My mind raced, but all I could think of was getting to my son. He was alone. Alone in a hospital, with a life-altering procedure scheduled, and his grandparents, the people I trusted to be his support, were skipping out to pamper their dog. I didn't know how this had happened. Why hadn't they told me? Why hadn't they called me to explain? But there wasn't time for questions, not now. I had to get to him. As I started the car, my mind was in a blur. How could they do this? They knew how important this was. My son had been through so much already, and now, this. I gripped the wheel tighter, the anger and fear mixing into a bitter cocktail. But deep down, I knew one thing. No one would ever take care of him like I would. And if I had to tear down everything in my path to protect him, I would. The road ahead was long, but nothing would stop me from getting to him. Not this time. I pressed the gas pedal harder, determination fueling, every inch of the way. My mind raced as I drove, my grip on the steering wheel tightening with each passing minute. I had no idea what was really going on, but something felt off. Why hadn't they told me they were skipping out on my son? Why wasn't anyone responding to my frantic messages? Why was I the last to know? The questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could think about was getting to him. I had to remind myself that my son needed me, and he needed me to stay calm. But it was hard. Everything in me wanted to scream, to confront my in-laws and demand an explanation for their cruelty. Instead, I focused on my son's voice, the desperation, the fear in his words. He needed me. I could already picture it, his small form in that cold hospital bed, alone. The sterile smell of the operating room, the monitors beeping softly in, the background. I knew that feeling of vulnerability too well. I had been there as a child, feeling as if the whole world was moving on without me. And now my son was experiencing that same thing. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the anger threatening to overtake me. I had to think clearly. I had to get to him. The drive seemed to stretch forever. The closer I got, the more frantic I became. My mind flashed to all the times my in-laws had let me down in the past. How they'd been there for their dog more than they ever had for me or my son. It's just a dog. A dog. They couldn't even show up for a major surgery. Get A grip, I whispered to myself, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Stay calm. You have to be there for him. I called the hospital again, but it went straight to voicemail. The nurse I had spoken to earlier wasn't answering her phone either. Panic bubbled up again, but I shoved it down. I didn't have time for panic. I remembered the last time my son had needed me, when he'd been sick, when he'd gotten hurt, when no one else stepped up. I always stepped in. I always protected him. I had always been there for him when no one else could be. And I wasn't about to fail him now. As I neared the hospital, I felt a rush of guilt and fear. What if I was too late? What if they didn't let me in because of all the confusion? What if my son was lying there, terrified, without me by his side? I shook my head, pushing those thoughts away. I'm his mother. I'll never let him down. I parked the car as quickly as I could, but before I even took a step toward the entrance, my phone buzzed again. I didn't need to look at it to know who it was him. As I waited at the hospital, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. I had spent so many years making excuses for my in-laws, convincing myself that maybe I was the one overreacting, that their behavior was just a little quirky, maybe even harmless. But deep down, I knew the truth. Their priorities had never aligned with mine. It started with the little things. The holidays that always seemed to be too busy for them to attend, the missed birthdays, the last-minute cancellations. My son had always been left waiting for a birthday gift that never came, waiting for a visit that never happened. It was as if we were always second place to Daisy, their dog. In the beginning, I tried to understand. I told myself that my in-laws were getting older, that maybe they needed more space, more time. I even suggested we visit them more often, that we could work around their schedule. But their responses were always the same. We're not that busy, we just need a little more time with Daisy. I wasn't blind to their favoritism, but I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to believe they cared about my son. After all, he was their grandchild, their flesh and blood, but as the years passed, it became impossible to ignore. Their attention was always on Daisy, who, mind you, was spoiled beyond belief. They'd cancel family dinners because Daisy needed a walk. They'd rearrange holiday plans so she could attend a dog birthday party. I couldn't help but wonder if Daisy was their true priority, and we were just an afterthought. It wasn't until my son turned 5 and began asking why Grandma and Grandpa never seemed to make time for him that I started to wake up. Why? Don't they like me, Mom? He asked one night, his small voice full of confusion. I had no answer for him then, and I still didn't have an answer now. All I knew was that I had to protect him, that I couldn't let him grow up feeling unloved or unwanted by the people who should have been there for him. The tipping point came when my son got sick and needed to stay home from school. I asked my in-laws to help watch him for just a few hours while I worked. Their response? We have a dog groomer appointment. We can't cancel it. I had been asking for help for years, and each time their excuses seemed to grow more absurd. I couldn't deny it any longer. I was alone in this. My husband tried to play peacekeeper, always making excuses for their behavior, but even he couldn't deny that something was off. And yet, I kept hoping. I kept convincing myself that they loved my son, that this was just a phase, that things would get better. But every small disappointment, every failure to show up when it mattered, chipped away at that hope. Now, as I sat in that hospital waiting room, I realized something. This wasn't just a few bad decisions. This was a pattern of neglect, of selfishness, of choosing a dog over family. And it was clear to me now that their actions had consequences. My son was no longer going to be the one who suffered because of their choices. I had waited long enough. The time for excuses was over. By the time the nurse came in to update me, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I was beyond frustrated, but I had to remain calm. I needed to be strong for my son, especially if he was going to have to relive what happened. When the nurse handed me a small file, I couldn't help but notice that my hands were shaking. She had already filled me in on the rescheduled surgery time, but now she handed me something I wasn't expecting. It was an incident report, detailing the fact that my son had been left alone in the pre-op area for over 30 minutes before the surgery was supposed to start. The report stated that, while they had attempted to call his grandparents, no one had picked up. No one had called me either. I stared at the paper in disbelief. How could they let this happen? My thoughts raced as I looked at the timestamps. They knew. They knew they were supposed to be there, but they chose not to come. Instead, they chose a dog spa day. It was almost too much to absorb. I needed more than just a report to truly understand what had happened, so I pressed further. I asked the nurse to pull the security footage from the pre-op area. I couldn't shake the feeling that my son's vulnerability was more than just negligence. It was intentional. The footage confirmed my worst fears. My son was alone in the small, sterile room. His eyes darted around nervously, searching the empty hallway for any sign of family. There were a few moments where he clutched the stuffed animal I'd given him that morning, looking down at it as if it were his only source of comfort. I almost couldn't breathe. There was my son, waiting for a surgery he had been told was urgent, and his own family had abandoned him in that moment of need. He had been scared, but that wasn't all. As I reviewed the footage further, I noticed something else. At 10:15 a.m., my in-laws' car was seen pulling out of the hospital parking lot, the same time my son was supposed to be prepped for surgery. My heart sank into my stomach. They were already leaving the hospital when they knew my son was just moments away from going under anesthesia. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had to stay focused. This wasn't just an oversight. This was a choice to prioritize a dog over my child's safety. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together now. The casual indifference toward my son had been building for years. The dog spa days, the missed birthdays, the emotional neglect, it was all part of a toxic pattern I had refused to see until now. I was fooling myself by thinking it was a mistake. But now the evidence was clear. My son's words echoed in my mind. Mom, they said they couldn't come. They're taking Daisy to the spa. The truth was brutal. They didn't care. They never cared. Daisy was more important to them than their own flesh and blood. And this was the breaking point. But I wasn't just going to sit here and accept this. I had the proof. My son had been abandoned when he needed his family most. There was no more room for excuses. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear. I was going to make sure my son never went through this again. I stood up from the chair, the file in my hand, and walked to the nurse's station. I was done waiting. It was time to take action. I didn't waste any time. I left the nurse's station with the incident report in hand and my heart pounding in my chest. The gravity of the situation hit me like a truck. My son had been left vulnerable, abandoned by the very people who should have been there for him. And now, with this evidence in my hands, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But what I hadn't anticipated was how far my in-laws would go to cover up their actions. I dialed my husband, trying to keep my voice steady. He had been working and didn't know what was happening. He needed to understand, but I couldn't make sense of it all at once. "You need to come to the hospital now," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "What's going on? Why are you calling me now?" His voice was filled with confusion. "They didn't show up," I said, fighting to keep the tears from overwhelming me. "They left him. They went to take Daisy to the spa." There was silence on the other end. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. Are you sure? They wouldn't do that. But I wasn't sure anymore. I had seen the footage. I had the report. They did it. I have the proof, I snapped, the anger now flooding my words. I need you to come now, and I need you to help me stop this. We need to get them to understand what they've done. As soon as I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't let my son go through this kind of betrayal again. I had barely processed that thought when my phone buzzed again. It was my mother-in-law. Where are you? We're on our way to pick up your son, she texted as if nothing had happened. The casual tone, the lack of accountability, it made my blood run cold. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my throat. On their way? They didn't have the right to just waltz back into our lives as if they hadn't completely failed us. As if my son hadn't been left alone in a hospital room for half an hour, afraid and neglected. I responded quickly, my fingers trembling. No. Stay away. I don't ever want you near my son again. It felt good to finally speak those words aloud, even if it was over text. I had been walking on eggshells around them for far too long. But now I had no patience left for their excuses or their guilt-tripping. I was ready for whatever came next. Minutes later, my husband arrived, his face pale as he approached me in the waiting room. "What's going on?" he asked softly, glancing around. The tension was thick, and I could tell he was caught between disbelief and anger. "They're not coming near him again," I said, my voice low but firm. They chose Daisy over him. They chose a dog spa day over their grandson's surgery. I'm done making excuses for them. He ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. I didn't know it was this bad. You never did, I said, my eyes flashing. Because you didn't want to see it. But now it's out in the open, and we need to protect him. He needs us. Just then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. It was my mother-in-law. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "We're outside. We've come to help with the surgery." The audacity. The sheer audacity. Could feel my pulse quicken, my protective instinct screaming to get her away from us. My son was safe now, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "You're not welcome here," I said, cutting her off before she could say another word. "You had your chance. You chose your dog over your grandson. You're done." I hung up, turning to my husband. "We're going to make sure this never happens again." It was clear now. This wasn't just about a missed surgery. This was about years of neglect, of enabling toxic behavior, and of me finally finding the courage to stand up. For my son. For us. And I wasn't backing down. The weight of the situation hit me as soon as I hung up the phone. This wasn't just a family issue anymore. It was a matter of my son's safety. I couldn't let this slide. My son had been harmed, emotionally neglected, and left vulnerable. And now it was time to make sure that everyone, including the authorities, understood just how serious this was. Without hesitation, I dialed child services. The voice on the other end was calm, but firm, asking for the details. I didn't sugarcoat it. I explained everything: the missed surgery, the blatant disregard for my child's well-being, the evidence of neglect I had in hand. I shared the video footage, the medical reports, the texts, all of it. They listened. They didn't brush me off or downplay my concerns. This wasn't just a grandmother and grandfather letting their dog get in the way. This was a toxic family. Dynamic. One that had been harming my child for years. The woman on the other line assured me that they would begin an official investigation immediately. I was relieved, but also more determined than ever. Soon after, I received a call from the police. The investigation was in full swing. They would be sending officers to my in-laws' house to speak with them, but they needed my full cooperation. They would need to interview my son and take his statement. I didn't know how he would handle it, but I had to trust that we were doing the right thing. While I waited for them to arrive, I kept looking at the evidence, trying to calm myself. I had no idea how my in-laws would react to the involvement of the authorities, but one thing was clear. I wasn't backing down. They would face consequences. When the officers finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief, but also a deep sense of sadness. I had hoped, I had prayed, that this day would never come. But it had, and I was now doing everything I could to make sure my son's voice was heard. He had been silenced by my in-laws for far too long, but now, with official support, his truth would be out in the open. The police officer, a calm and empathetic woman, turned to me. "We'll take it from here. We'll speak with your in-laws and review the evidence. You've done the right thing by calling us." For a brief moment, I felt the weight of the past months lift from my shoulders. Finally, someone was listening. I had done what I had to do. Now it was in their hands. But one thing was for sure. I wouldn't rest until I knew my son was safe, and my in-laws had to face the consequences of their actions. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. My phone was constantly buzzing with updates, calls, and messages from the authorities. The investigation was progressing faster than I'd anticipated. I had handed over the evidence, and now it was time for the truth to come to light. It wasn't just about a missed surgery anymore. It was about the years of emotional neglect, manipulation, and toxic behavior that had been building up under the surface. The authorities were taking this seriously, and they weren't going to let it slide. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Then came the call that hit me like a freight train. The police had gone to my in-laws' house. They had confronted them with the evidence I provided, and their reaction was nothing short of appalling. They denied everything, of course. They claimed they didn't know my son was in surgery that day, that it was a miscommunication. But the evidence was undeniable. The video footage, the incident report, the text messages, they couldn't deny it. Within days, my in-laws were facing an official investigation, and things began to spiral for them. They couldn't keep up their facade of innocence. The toxic behavior that had been dismissed for years was now front and center, and it was being scrutinized. But it didn't stop there. The legal consequences for their neglect were swift and severe. My in-laws were formally charged with child endangerment and emotional abuse. They were no longer just the quirky grandparents in the family. They were now perpetrators of a serious crime. It felt surreal to say those words aloud, but I knew it was the right thing. My son's safety was worth any fight. The legal proceedings were drawn out, but as time went on, the truth became clearer. They had been using their financial control over the family for years, manipulating situations to make sure they stayed in control, to make sure they stayed in the center of attention. At one point, we discovered that they had been siphoning money from my son's trust fund without telling us. Money that was supposed to be for his future. When this was revealed, the police opened an additional investigation into financial fraud. I had always trusted them with this responsibility, but now, it was clear they had been taking advantage of us. The social consequences were swift. Word of their behavior spread quickly throughout the family. Their friends turned their backs on them, and even their own siblings started distancing themselves. The reputation they had carefully built for years crumbled before their eyes. I watched it all unfold, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. They had chosen their priorities, and now they were paying the price. And then came the best part, the moment I knew everything had changed. My son's trust fund was returned in full. Not only that, but he was now entitled to compensation for the emotional damage caused by their actions. It was justice, and it felt sweet. My son, the one who had been abandoned for a dog, was now going to get what he deserved. protection and security for his future. But the best part? My son was safe. That was the real victory. As the legal battles dragged on, I focused on what mattered most. My son. I had fought for him, for his safety, and for his future. And in the end, I knew I had done everything I could to make sure he would never have to feel abandoned again. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a new normal. It wasn't the same as before, of course. Nothing could ever be the same after all that had happened. But my son and I found a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. He had always been my world, but now I saw him through new eyes. He was resilient, he was strong, and he was safe. The emotional toll of everything we had been through started to ease. My son was thriving. He started sleeping through the night again, no longer plagued by nightmares of abandonment. He even started drawing again, his artwork brighter and more colorful than it had been in months. He wasn't just recovering physically from the surgery anymore. He was healing emotionally, too. We had set new boundaries with the rest of the family, keeping our distance from toxic influences. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt the weight of being the bad guy, but I knew deep down that I had made the right choice. Protecting my son was the most important thing I could ever do. As time went on, I began to feel the weight of the past lift. The legal battles were behind us, and my in-laws had disappeared from our lives, the consequences of their actions now clear to everyone. I had finally broken free of the chains of family expectations that had kept me silent for so long, but most importantly, my son was happy again. I know many of you reading this have probably been in similar situations. You've had to make the impossible choice between family and your child's well-being. And it's hard. It's heartbreaking. But you have to remember this. You are not alone. Did I make the right decision? Yes, I would do it again 1,000 times over for my son. So, I'm asking you, have you ever faced a similar situation? How did you protect your children from toxic influences? Let's talk about it. Share your stories in the comments below. I want to hear from you. Let's build a community of moms who protect each other, who fight for their children, no matter what. Together, we're stronger.